the existence of God. The scientific method rigorously applied has to deal with things which are observable, and by definition God is not observable. Hence science has no way of disproving the existence of God. The most one can do is to say, well, we know why people believed in God. We can retrace in history that people, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of their upbringing, they believed in God. But let's take these points one at a time. Is it right to say that because people might have believed through fear, therefore God doesn't exist? In fact, even if people believed it for the wrong reason, God may still exist. So proving the reason to be not a good one does not disprove the contention itself. Otherwise we fall into what is called the genetic fallacy, explaining the truth or falsity of an idea based on the origin of the idea. That doesn't work. Second, one may say, well, it is because of your upbringing. Again, that is committing the genetic fallacy. In fact, you may say that those who say that we believe in religion because of our upbringing may be saying that because of their upbringing. But we wouldn't do that because that would commit the genetic fallacy. Moreover, scientists may want to argue for their atheism by saying that we can explain scientifically how things work. And since we can explain how things work, we do not need to invoke a God for how things work. Well, in Islam, the way we see this is that the way things work does not exclude the possibility of a creator. In fact, the Quran, without embarrassment, describes how the rain comes. But yet the Quran gives credit to a God who made it possible for rain to come through the process that scientists might be able to elucidate even further. The Quran describes how babies are born in infinite detail, and yet the Quran gives credit for that to God. The Quran, on the one hand, does not try to show that the things which human beings are unable to understand are the things which are creditable to God. But the Quran is making it plain that even the things which you can understand and appreciate and you can explain still need a God. And so we should now turn then to the proofs which would show that there is a God, even for scientists. Now when we ask, first of all, where do things come from? Why do we have something instead of nothing? We know that from nothing, nothing comes. There was a time when scientists believed in what is called the steady state theory. They replied that the universe was just always here. It didn't come from no place, it just happens to be here. But then in the 1920s, scientists started to discover that we are living in an expanding universe. In fact, when Einstein had worked out his theory of relativity, it was clear that an implication from that theory is that the universe is expanding. But you see, if the universe is expanding, it means it used to be smaller in the past, and we can retrace our steps till we get to something very small, maybe the size of a pea or a proton, even nothing. To avoid this sort of implication, Einstein introduced into his equations what he called the cosmological constant, to keep the universe from expanding. But the universe didn't obey Einstein and kept on expanding. In fact, the Quran makes allusion to this when the Quran says in Surah 51, verse number 47, وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ. The heavens we have created with power, and we are expanding it. I understand that Dr. Atkins hadn't had an opportunity to study Islam perhaps as I have, and so he was not aware that there was something to this effect in the Quran. I recall he said that there is no scripture which says that the universe is expanding, but here is one, folks. Now, the idea that the universe is expanding then leaves us to think back in time to the origin of the universe, and that brings us back to the original question: where did everything come from? And this argues for the existence of a God who brought everything into being. Some will try to explain even that origin without needing to posit the existence of a God. And Dr. Atkins has tried this in his book entitled Creation Revisited, but he found himself in the later chapters of that book winding up in self-contradiction. He has to talk about a time before time. He has to talk about space-time before space-time. And he has to talk about some mathematical points, because you had nothing in existence at the time, but you can posit mathematical points which of course have neither length nor breadth. And you can talk about these swirling, and eventually we can have the universe as we do have now. But how did these points come into being? According to Dr. Atkins, you need time in order for the points to come into being. But you cannot have time without the points already having come into being. So he ends up saying that time brought the points into being, and the points brought time into being. Well, we can escape this contradiction by admitting the obvious, that there is a God who brought time and space into being. Second, I'd like to argue for design in the universe as another proof for the existence of God. Dr. Atkins will agree that the universe has an appearance of having been designed. Scientists tell us now that at the origin of the universe, the four fundamental constants of physics must have been minutely fine-tuned in order for the universe to exist as it does. If, for example, let's take just one item. Let's talk about the mass of the universe. If the density of mass was more or less, we would not have the universe that we have. So it appears that the exact amount was fine-tuned right from the beginning. Colin Ronan, in his book entitled The Universe, says that at Planck time, 10 to the minus 43, if the universe, the density of the universe differed than it was in more than one part in 10 to the minus 49, the universe would not have existed. So it appears that the exact amount was fine-tuned right from the beginning. So that argues for a fine-tuning and a God as the fine-tuner. Now, someone may reply, well, it has the appearance of being fine-tuned because here we are to observe it. If it wasn't fine-tuned, it wouldn't have existed, and we wouldn't have been here to observe it. But this is just an apology given to avoid the implication that there is a God. Why? If I were to give you, let's take a mental experiment. I give each of you a dice, and I ask you to roll it, and it turns out to be 6. Whenever you look around at your friends, you see everybody's got a 6 up. Now, you might initially conclude that these dice are fixed. But it would be a little bit far-fetched if you think, well, of course it turns up 6s, because this guy's been doing it all around the world, up and down the country. He's been having students rolling dice, and we just happened to be here on the one occasion when it came out right. It's a little bit far-fetched. More far-fetched even is to imagine there must be other public speakers like Shabir Ally turning around the world, and he's having lots of other university students rolling dices, and we happen to be the one group that happens to be with the speaker who gets it right. It doesn't seem to be the right way to go about it. It seems more likely that what we observe as fixed really is fixed, and for that you need someone to have fixed it. So we have here an argument for the existence of God. I'd like now to go to the second proposition and show that we actually need both science and religion, that they're not two competing ways of looking at the world, but two complementary ways. Stephen Jay Gould, in his recently published book entitled Rocks of the Ages, says that all human beings must pay at least rudimentary attention to both magisteria of religion and science. I should point out that Stephen Jay Gould is inclined towards atheism, and he's one of the most famous popularizers of evolution in modern times. Yet Stephen Jay Gould understands that science and religion are two complementary ways of looking at the world. And Gould cites, for example, some very important points. How can we answer ethical questions in science alone? We cannot. Science can tell us that bacteria, bugs, and us are made of the same stuff, but science cannot tell us that we are worth more than bugs or bacteria. Whether we are or are not, it is an ethical question that has to be answered not by science, but by religion. Well, Gould expressed his disgust with some of his colleagues, fellow scientists, who try to caricature religion, erecting religion as a straw man for rhetorical purposes, and they try to present science as though it is a panacea of human progress against that absurd caricature. And then he continues, he says, quote, "If these colleagues wish to fight superstition, irrationalism, ignorance, dogma, and a host of other insults to the human intellect, then God bless them, but don't call this enemy religion." That's in pages 209 to 210 of his book. So we do need both science and religion. Can science alone suffice? No. Science cannot prescribe moral precepts. Science is capable of sending 2 astronauts out into outer space, but cannot prescribe for these astronauts that one should not rape or murder the other one. According to the hypothesis presented by Dr. Atkins, people just simply learned over time that it is more beneficial to be good to others. But if, according to that hypothesis, if one of these scientists, one of these astronauts, decides that it is more beneficial to himself to be the lone colonizer of a distant planet, then it would be beneficial for him to rape and murder his opponent at will, and there would be no way for science to prescribe against that happening. The origin of human consciousness cannot be explained by science. Dr. Atkins himself admits that there is no explanation in science that can fully account for human consciousness. The origin of life cannot be fully accounted for. Some scientists who have tried to account for it found themselves presenting some very strange explanations. Francis Crick, for example, who shared the Nobel Prize in 1962 for his unraveling of the DNA double helix, in his book published 1981 entitled Life Itself, proposes that life must have got here upon Earth because some alien intelligence might have filled spaceships with spores and sent these spaceships out, computer-controlled, to find planets like ours and drop their payloads. It sounds a little bit far-fetched and much simpler to believe in God creating life as it is. The origin of the universe cannot be fully explained by scientists. As Robert Jastrow says, it is not just simply a matter of another experiment or another decade of experiments. The way it looks now, science will never be able to probe the mystery of the origin of the universe. The laws of science break down and can only apply up to Planck time, which is 10 to the minus 43 seconds, but science cannot go beyond that as it appears at the moment. Will that happen in the future? If it does, we will gladly embrace the knowledge of how science explains that, but that would not displace belief in God, because science will explain the how of things happen, and our religion teaches us the who of how things happen. A pathologist can proceed in his job without asking the question about who. When a pathologist deals with a dead person, the pathologist only is concerned with how the death occurred, not with who caused that death. That has to be decided in a court of law. In a similar sense, science can explain the how of things, but not the who of things. Let me then talk a little bit about the tension and conflict between science and religion. Some religions are mythological. Scientists would not find this to be fitting for their understanding. Some religions prescribe unreasonable doctrines, asking you to believe things which you know do not add up. Scientists cannot accept that. Some religions prescribe beliefs and teachings which are shown to be non-scientific and unscientific. Science cannot accept that. And so the history of the conflict between religion and science is now entrenched in the minds of many who are familiar with many religions but haven't had the opportunity to learn more about Islam. For example, the tension between religion and science was heightened in the European Enlightenment period when scientists noticed a few points that were insisted upon in the religion that they were most familiar with. For example, where religion insisted upon geocentricity, that the earth is the center of the universe, and that had to be displaced. But we know that in order to displace that idea, some scientists had to struggle, and Galileo was imprisoned for the rest of his life, or placed under house arrest for his belief that the earth is not the center of the universe. The usefulness of the earth. Some people propose that the earth is less than 10,000 years old based on their understanding of a religious book. That religious book, folks, is not the glorious Quran, which does not prescribe the geocentricity of the earth, nor does it prescribe a young age for the earth. The fixity of the species is another thing that has been insisted upon in another religion, that in the European Enlightenment period had to be argued against. I do not find in the Quran anything that tells us that the species are fixed. The universality of the flood is another such idea, which in fact the Quran displaces. The Quran, studied carefully, shows that the flood of Noah was not a universal flood. Well, now let's talk about the possible harmony then between science and Islam in the remaining 2 minutes that I have. First, the Quran emphasizes learning and study. So the Quran is not counter-science, but the Quran encourages science and growth. The discoveries in science will not displace religious faith because, again, they're dealing with two different areas of human understanding. For this reason, we see that many early Muslim scientists excel in a number of areas. For example, Al-Khwarizmi wrote a book on algebra, and actually the word algebra comes from the title of his book, Al-Jabr. So the modern study of algebra, in fact, has roots in the origins in Islamic scholars doing their work. In his book entitled The Shape of the Earth, he left no one in doubt. Let me point out that Al-Khwarizmi died in the year 850, more than 1,100 years ago. 500 years before Galileo, a man by the name of Al-Baruni discussed the rotation of the earth. So there is no conflict between religion and science. But can the Quran commend itself to modern scientists? Yes. In fact, Dr. Keith Moore, a scientist in Toronto, professor of embryology, whose textbooks are studied in universities throughout the Western world, having studied the Quranic statements on the growth and development of the human embryo, concluded that these statements could not have been discovered as truth prior to the discovery of the microscope. Only after the microscope could these things be studied, and he found the Quran to be amazingly accurate in the things that it said. And he finally concluded his study by saying, I hope that the agreement I have found between the Quranic statements on the one hand and scientific discoveries on the other may help close the gap between science and religion, which has existed for so many years. So finally, I put before you folks 4 propositions. 1, science does not support atheism, rather theism. 2, we need both science and religion. They're not in conflict but should be in harmony. 3, the history of tension and conflict between science and religion involve not Islam but other religions. And 4, now we can see that there can be a harmony between Islam and science, and I commend to all of you Islam.
If I'd been able to interrupt, I would have interrupted at the end of most sentences and said I disagree with that. I think what we saw from Shabir Ally was a display typical of, if I may say, philosophers, that they are basically pessimists. They say, this cannot be done, this will not be done, it's inconceivable that this can be done. Whereas in fact, that should be seen in contrast to scientists who say, okay, we can't do it now, but let's go out and try to do it. And if you look at the history of science, you see that it has overcome the pessimism displayed by philosophers. The sight is that philosophers have to never learn to catch up every time that science shows that the pessimistic statement of a philosopher is in fact false. We're told that scientists will neither, sorry, slightly exaggerate, but cannot, but let me expand that to never, because it's more dramatic, understand or be able to explain human consciousness. Now, there's a huge amount of effort going on at the moment. I admit that it's a very difficult problem. There are two very difficult problems in the world of science. One is at the beginning, the origin of the universe. I agree that's really difficult, but we're getting ourselves equipped to deal with it. Now there is at the other end, the emergence in this glorious creation of consciousness. And science has, because consciousness involves so many different aspects of science, it's only recently that scientists have started to turn their attention to it. There's no sign that we will not be able to elucidate consciousness. And to say that we cannot is 2 is 3, that is. Yeah, gosh. And to say that it's just a sign of pessimism. It's also true of the origin of life. A difficult problem, no shortage of ideas, but we can't prove which of those ideas currently is correct. The origin of the universe, we're told that physical laws break down. At the Planck time, of course they do, but we know the way ahead. We've got to combine general relativity and quantum theory. When we've done that, we can be pretty confident that we shall be at time 0. I believe in Occam's razor. And you will see that pervading my talk earlier this evening, I was really drawing upon Occam's razor by saying that if we can explain everything there is without drawing upon something else, then we should accept that the former is the more plausible explanation. I maintain that just about everything in the world can be 2. Thank you. Just say 2. I can't see from here. Everything in the world can be explained without invoking God, therefore God is in fact not necessary. I think it wrong to say that we can't understand human behavior scientifically, which I think was implied. The whole science of ethology is about the behavior of organisms, and it is by extending the concept of organism to ourselves and looking at over our evolutionary history that we can see how we behave. It's ludicrous to say that an astronaut in a spacecraft won't kill the other person because of whatever it is. We're not talking about individuals, we're talking about the evolution of societies over thousands of years, not just people trapped in a tiny little capsule somewhere. It's wrong to say that we cannot understand how something can come from nothing. In fact, if you were to look around and assess this universe, and I don't have time to go into the very subtle arguments that you touched on, and almost summarise them in my view correctly, but there are subtle arguments about the origin of the universe, something coming from nothing. My view would be that if you do the sum correctly, that is, if you, let's say, instead of simplifying things, assess the total amount of energy in the universe, then the total amount of energy in the universe is in fact exactly 0. And so indeed nothing has come from nothing. And the amazing thing is that the nothing that surrounds us is so extraordinarily complex. Thank you.
Folks, in my opening presentation, I put before you 4 proposals which I argued for. One, that science does not support atheism, but rather it supports theism. It supports a belief in God. Now, Dr. Atkins has not been able to show how, in fact, science disproves the existence of God. And I think that proposal, therefore, stands. Dr. Atkins has argued for